Hello everybody, my name is Michael Harkey. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is disaster planning meets awareness training meets risk monitoring. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question as you see it here. I will make sure that they get answered by Dan or myself. I will also be chatting the links mentioned by myself or Dan via the chat. Thanks for the feedback. We are recording and offering these webinars. It takes about a month. The last webinar on awareness in all directions is up. You can find it at my.infotext.com/all directions. Again, based on your feedback, we are using GoToWebinar now, so please forgive our growing pains. For those of you who are MSSP clients, we are working on providing assistance on the CATS baseline requirement for quarterly firewall rules review and hope to have word by January 1st, 2017. We've pushed this back slightly. Also, coming soon, we are revamping our IT governance library. These include complete boilerplate sets of all of our boilerplates. We are changing up our giveaway slightly. We are giving away another SOC 1 or SOC 2 review to clients, and for non-clients, our complete policy set worth billions. You must be present when we draw towards the end of the webinar to win. That's a $600 value for the SOC, $400 for Infotext clients. This is the 11th stop in our 2016 IT governance tour. Our next 3 webinars have been announced, with the next webinar being October 19th at 9 a.m. One thing we're hoping you can start giving us some feedback on, and we'll have a poll about this at the end of the webinar if we have time. In the first quarter, we're thinking about having a webinar that is intended to be actual training for your incident response team. So think about this and let us know at the end of the webinar, would you invite your whole team to a webinar like this? We're talking about maybe a 2-hour webinar. Can you see yourself gathering around the HDTV to view a webinar on incident response meant to be directed at your entire team? We will also be initiating a survey directly after the webinar and ask you take a minute to fill out the short questionnaire. We would really appreciate it. Dan has an NECUL workshop on incident response and the cybersecurity assessment tool on September 22nd at 9 a.m. All credit unions and banks are welcome to attend. This is not free but recommended. I will be including the invitation in the handout section of GoToWebinar. And so, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, the awareness guru of Indiana, the man with 13 letters after his name. We call him the Sheriff of the North, the Breaker of Tech, the Bringer of Policy, Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate that introduction. And before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick shout out to Amanda. I was auditing her yesterday, and she told me she couldn't make it to the webinar this morning. And so hopefully she'll see this when she watches the movie. I want to talk today about the intersection of awareness training, risk management, and business continuity. And so I'm going to start off just by summarizing, those 3 processes that we already have built in our information security program. And then, kind of drill down a little bit about threat analysis and then explain why I feel that incident response. If you've seen any of my earlier webinars, you probably already know that I believe incident response is the intersection of awareness, risk management, and business continuity. And then I'm hoping I can dwell on a way to ensure that we are gaining what we can gain by having a good incident response program in terms of its impact on awareness, risk management, and business continuity. So let's just start off with awareness training. I like to diagram the way processes fit together in an IT governance program. If you've been to my workshops, if you've seen our boilerplates for our policies and procedures, you'll see that we use these funky diagrams. And I talk about awareness in all directions because I believe that in order for us to really do a good job of awareness training, we need to provide it to our management team as well as our technical team. Of course, our users, and most of you probably already have a good user awareness training program in place. And then due to some regulation that was released in 2011, we also need to be concerned about training our customers, or at least providing information to our customers on a regular basis, so that if they cause an incident, we can demonstrate that we, bent over backwards, did everything we could to warn them of the risk they face because they're connecting to our online banking systems via the internet. And in our last webinar, Awareness in All Directions, we talked about awareness training really being a two-way street, that it's not really just, you getting up in front of your team once a year and walking them through a PowerPoint presentation. It really involves the way you interact with all of your team members, with the management team, with the technical team, with even your customers. And so, I like to kind of, help people understand why awareness training is so important by reminding them, and boy, we're coming up on the 15th anniversary of 911 on Sunday. And so, I've been saying since 911 that awareness training is 9/11ths of the battle. And what I mean by that is that we were far more secure the day after 911 than we were the day before. And the main reason why is because we became aware of the 4 risk factors that also are used in IT governance and in taking a risk-based approach to everything that we do when it comes to managing technology risk. And this makes a good segue, by the way, into the next thing I want to accomplish in this webinar, which is summarizing the risk management process. And so in every bank and every credit union and every hospital and in every organization that is now starting to manage technology risk, we really have 3 processes going on. We measure the risk, and then based on that measurement, we decide how we're going to respond to risk that residually represents too high of a risk. It pops above our risk appetite. And then once we've determined the risk that we're going to accept, we want to monitor the accepted risk. And that in a nutshell is what the guidance requires us to do when it comes to technology risk management. One type of risk is the fact that natural disasters, man-made threats, and other types of unexpected events could cause our IT systems to become unavailable. And so we call that availability risk. And we can summarize business continuity, which is the set of controls, it's the processes that management designs to respond to availability risk. And we can summarize that by saying that there's really 3 processes ongoing when it comes to business continuity. First of all, we have the threat analysis, and we need to prioritize which assets we need to protect from an availability perspective, and also, which ones are going to bring up first, second, third, etc. And so we talk a lot about recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, but we all are now writing up business impact analyses so that we can adequately address availability threats and address how we're going to bring systems back up. And then, of course, there's a lot of effort and time spent in planning for threat occurring. And then, of course, we need to train our team and make sure the team is ready for when that disaster occurs. And so, in a nutshell, that's what we mean by awareness training, risk management, and business continuity. I'd like to kind of drill down a little bit on business continuity threats. Here in Indiana, most of us are concerned about, losing our power, maybe via an ice storm or, a flood or somebody, accidentally cuts a power line or whatever, and same with telecommunications outages. But most of our business continuity plans or disaster recovery plans are, focused in on the threats that we feel are of the highest likelihood when it comes to our threat analysis. And, I have sometimes talked to my clients about the fact that, hey, we did all test our pandemic plan when it was on the federal regulators checklist, and we need to update that pandemic on a regular basis more due to compliance risk than pandemic risk. Most smaller organizations are going to be able to get through a pandemic a lot easier than, a Chase or a Bank of America can, because we're used to losing a third of our bank when it's summertime and everybody's taking vacation. So, but, we still need to have that in place for compliance reasons. But the other types of low likelihood threats we're really not that concerned about, and I think for good reasons. We also have man-made threats most people are identifying in their business impact analysis. They really represent a very low likelihood, but from an impact severity, it's a black swan event. And let's face it, I feel that if a nuclear, explosion occurs somewhere in Indiana, most of us don't really have a good scenario response ready for a nuclear war. I think most of us are like, I think there's going to be bigger fish to fry. And auditors like me are kind of on the same page with banks when they're prioritizing things that way. But I'd like to kind of, talk a little bit about the threat of sabotage. And the reason why is because I feel like, A, that really is a crossover into incident response, which is, obviously what this webinar is eventually going to lead to. But B, it also makes a great segue into a little story I like to tell to help people understand what I mean by a good incident response. And so if we can think back to the 80s, and those of you who are not old enough to remember these events, I'm sure you've heard about how in the 1980s, Tylenol had the ultimate business continuity event, a very black swan event that threatened the existence of their business when somebody was tampering with their pills and putting poison in their pills. And so we really are using Tylenol as an example of an excellent incident response program. They were very transparent. They were very quick to respond. They were truthful, even when the truth hurt. And they followed a prioritized process. First, they contained the event. They pulled their medicine off of every shelf in America. They no longer offered it for sale until they could eradicate the cause of people dying because they were taking Tylenol. And think about that. People were dying because they were using their product. That would put your business out of business. But what happened instead is they left us with the belief that they really valued the health of their customers because of the way they responded to that incident. And so I like to say that their business continued from a business continuity perspective. From an incident response perspective, they turned that lemon into lemonade. I also then like, and I should apologize to Target because I use them as an example on a regular basis of how not to respond to a cyber incident. And we all know the post-mortem on this by now, I'm pretty sure. They had a situation where, they could have really avoided a lot of damage had they, put a good triage process in place before the incident occurred. And, they really had a situation that was already bad, and they made it worse. And the main reason why is because they didn't see incident response as an intersection of awareness training, risk management, and business continuity. And what actually ended up happening is, they were governed by the wrong framework. So they were going back to their 12-step program called PCI, which is a great program for a gas station. But for a large organization, what ended up happening because they were complying with PCI and not some other program is they didn't recognize that PII, personally identifiable information, was more valuable than credit card numbers. Main reason why is because it's pretty easy to change a credit card number. It's kind of hard to change your identity. And so the result of that is very well illustrated by the question, if you need to say something bad to your customers, if you need to contact every one of your customers and say, we goofed up, how many times do you want to do that? They ended up having to do it twice. And the reason why is because they notified their customer base using legally sanctioned practices, and they notified the fact that 80 million people need to change their credit card, but then they realized, oh shoot, we also lost their identities, and so they weren't really truly through the triage process before they went into the customer notification process, and therefore they had to send out another notice about a month later saying, oh, and also you might want to protect your identity. And so, not only did Target, not turn that lemon into lemonade, they kind of turned that lemon into a rotten lemon, right? But they also became an example for consultants like me because we want to make sure that everybody learns that, A, they did not integrate the non-technical with the technical. In other words, their technical team discovered the incident in an appropriate amount of time. It took like 3 days for FireEye to notice that there was a virus on their system, but they could not escalate that properly. They couldn't get anybody to do anything about it because they hadn't integrated the technical with the non-technical. We already talked about the fact that they were kind of working off of a substandard framework, in our opinion. And don't get me wrong, PCI is important if you're a credit card user or processor or whatever, but it's not the end-all be-all framework for information security, that's for sure. Target's proved that. And then finally, they had invested in the right tools. FireEye, I guess, was costing them $2 million a year, and I like to remind my clients, that we're watching their networks, say, hey, FireEye would charge $2 million a year for something, but, jokingly, of course. But anyway, the bottom line is they didn't see them as awareness training tools. They didn't see them as tools that could help their business continuity plan. They just saw them as technical tools, and therefore, it took them 2 weeks before they even could do anything about the incident that was discovered, in an adequate amount of time. They certainly didn't turn those lemons into lemonade. What I like to do is I like to point out that, really what we're talking about here is integrating the non-technical with the technical, kind of a business continuity issue, you know what I mean? And then, which framework we're going to comply to is a very important risk management decision that thankfully financial institutions don't have to make because the FFIEC and your regulator has made that decision for you. And then finally, awareness training is an extremely important function that wasn't missing. The non-technical people, the people that would approve containment of that virus, which really required them to kind of take their systems down for a while, they were not aware of, what they should have been aware of. And so obviously, to me, the intersection of business continuity, risk management, and awareness, what this little funky, graphic in here, I'm saying that's incident response. And I'd like to just kind of talk a little bit about the primary differences and similarities between incident response and business continuity, because with business continuity, we definitely identify our threats, but we're not deliberately monitoring for tornadoes. And don't get me wrong, when, especially nowadays, everybody's got the Weather Channel on their iPhone. I mean, when the weather looks bad, which it's not looking too good out there in Lafayette, Indiana this morning, by the way, but when it looks bad, we're looking out the windows, we're watching we're watching for that tornado, but it's not like we have to meet on a regular basis to monitor the threat called tornado. Meanwhile, most incident response plans, and really we try to encourage our customers to make sure that their incident response plans are not centered around recovery time objectives, which is what a business continuity plan is centered around. If a tornado comes through and takes our data center out, we all have our RTOs, or our recovery time objectives, established so that we can adequately bring systems up within times that management expects. But with an incident, we're really more focused in on when and how do we notify our customers. And then finally, the actual the tools that we use to recover from an incident are usually much more technical than the tools we're using to recover from a tornado. A non-technical team can go a long way to help recover from a tornado, where a lot of times they're probably standing around twiddling their thumbs in an incident if they're not trained properly. And again, that training is important because that's how we integrate the technical with the non-technical parts of incident response. The similarities, though, is that we are prioritizing our plans, both the business continuity and the incident response plan, by risk. We're not going to plan for, you know, a nuclear war. And likewise, I don't think most banks are anymore planning for somebody hacking right directly through their firewall. I mean, we want to be conscious of the fact that if we're not patching our firewalls, that can still happen, but we're really more prioritizing our incident response plans around cyber threats that present a much higher likelihood. Like nowadays, it's ransomware. It's still pretext calling. It's still people calling the bank and asking for information that they're not really allowed to have. And so the similarity is we're prioritizing both plans by risk. It takes a team approach in both cases. We need to have the non-technical people as trained as the technical people in both the business continuity plan and the incident response plan. And then finally, both plans require regular meetings so that we can make sure that we are training the team, and in the case of incident response, there's also another important role that the team plays, and that's to actively monitor for risk. And so the way I've been trying to encourage my clients to monitor for risk is what we call the incident response team meeting. It's that thing that we're having a discussion with a lot of our audit clients about. Our managed services clients, we want to be on their incident response team, and we're more than happy to come in on a monthly basis to meet with them and help them understand the technical monitoring that we're doing. And so what I'd like to do now is just the next thing I'd like to do is, Mike, if you wouldn't mind triggering a poll, I'm going to go ahead and get the Jeopardy thing started. Of course, that music is credited to Alex Trebek and Jeopardy. I'm hoping that we are ready to close that poll. And what I'd like to say is that I'm hoping you all answered monthly. I suspect that you didn't. What are the results, Mike? What did we end up with?
Results are 9%, we don't have one, 36% annually, 9% quarterly, 18% bi-monthly, and 27% monthly.
So monthly still won out, is what I hear that say. So, wow, the 9%, boy, need to start working on that. If you're meeting annually, I feel like you have a team that's not trained, and so. I am a big believer in the fact that you can turn a monthly incident response team meeting into a productive way of doing the work of incident response, awareness training, some risk management, and some business continuity even, without having extra to-dos for individual team members. And I'm really big on that team approach to incident response. And so for those of you who are meeting annually or don't have an incident response team, what I would recommend you do is really start talking to the people on that team about the fact that we need a multidisciplinary team so we can assign roles to people and responsibilities to people, that it isn't really best for the technical guy or the technical person to handle. And what I mean by that is, do you really want the IT manager who's busy fighting the cyber incident to be the one that decides whether or not we're going to notify our customers or our members in the case of credit unions? Do we want the IT guy to be the guy that's watching for awareness training issues? Because if we're not staying on top of our awareness training, that actually increases cyber risk and also puts us in a position where there might be an incident that occurs and we don't even notice it, or we don't notice it until after our customers are telling us about it. I also feel that the first incident response team meeting that you hold should definitely start off establishing the incident response policy. How are we going to classify incidents, and when and how are we going to notify our customers? And then I like to, like I said at the beginning of the webinar, I like to kind of diagram how the overall incident response program fits together. What are the components of the program? For smaller organizations, I certainly wouldn't expect you to adopt an incident response log that you would have to fill out in every incident. But boy, let's have one available so that if we're ever frightened by the fact that something has occurred, and if we're ever in a situation where management's saying, boy, we better document this, let's already have the log ready so that we know what we need to document and in what order should we follow the process, not like Target did, I'm sorry, but like Tylenol did. They had a process that they followed. They did first things first. Let's make sure that we've got a good program in place that makes sure that we don't notify our customers until we have fully investigated the incident. Let's make sure that we understand that even if customer information is involved, we don't always have to notify our customers. And if we're going to choose not to notify our customers, or again, members in the case of credit unions, we definitely want to make sure that we've documented properly that we don't have to notify them, so that when we notify our examiner, which is part of the guidance, the examiner will agree with us, at least because they're not getting back to us saying, I think you should notify your customer. Then finally, of course, we would want to review the plan itself. And by the way, I think by this time we're probably up to about a 2-hour meeting. But then one of the very important components that an incident response team should be responsible for is risk monitoring. Remember, we saw that we need to monitor for risk and incident response much more than we monitored for risk in our business continuity program. And so we really need to make sure our team is aware of how they fit into the overall risk monitoring architecture and what we're counting on them to monitor for us. And again, I mean, by the time we're done with that, we're up to a 3-hour meeting if you're really doing a good meeting on an annual basis. And so to me, you ought to at least have a quarterly meeting, because that way you can spread these 6 items over the course of your year, and you'll have a much more trained team. And not only will your team be more trained, but they'll also be on guard more. If you're just having a meeting with them once a year, by the time we're into the 6th month of the year, everybody's going to forget, especially in, banking and, we've got tons and tons of guidance coming out that we have to respond to. Are we really going to remember in July what we discussed in January? And so I like to, again, diagram how, programs fit together, et cetera. And so, I just want to make sure, you see what I mean by that when it comes to incident response. Usually there's some high-level policy, FDIC banks call it their information security program. But, a lot of my banks are starting to call it their IT governance policy. And that really has been sanctioned by the management guidance that was released in December of 2015. But that high-level policy should require management to establish an incident response program that usually starts with an incident response policy. We actually have a 1-page policy because we want to make sure we're keeping the board of directors or the supervisory committees, or the audit committees, the risk management committee, whoever's going to approve such of a policy, to know just the facts, just what they need to know, and to really reduce what they're charging management to do to the important strategic rather than tactical issues related to incident response. And then, of course, that policy would require the creation of an incident response plan that then generally reaches out and establishes various tools. And again, depending on the size of your organization, you might call for an incident response log if you've got, millions of people that can fill that out in every case. Or you might just want to make sure that the incident response team is aware that, hey, we do have a log. Our plan doesn't call for it because we don't want to be painted into a corner. We don't want some auditor to say, hey, why didn't you fill out the incident response log when, that employee in the corner sneezed? Instead, smaller institutions are just making their team aware of all the response tools that are available, but it's not really a formal part of their system. But, we need to have a process in place to where, we already know the marketing people, the management people, senior management understands that, hey, if we do screw up, this is what we're going to be sending to our customers. It would be better for, the top people in the organization to have a feel for that before we are in an incident so that we don't have to escalate up and get their permission to do something that we're required by law to do anyway. And then again, there's some compliance risk in every incident, and we have to decide, are we going to need to file a SAR? Do we need to notify our primary federal regulator, et cetera? And then, most smaller organizations are outsourcing the technical monitoring part of the equation, network monitoring, event log monitoring, the building of a, a security information event management system, to a managed security service provider. And so if that's the case, great, because you're in the business of banking, not in the business of incident response. And so your MSSP should be able to help you with a lot of the incident response components, at least the technical components of incident response. But we better document in our plan their service level agreement so that when we are in an incident, we're not left wondering what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. But then do you see how this is really the intersection of business continuity, risk management, and awareness training? I mean, whenever we do a risk assessment, what we really should be doing is taking that accepted residual risk. In other words, the way we respond to the risk is A, we can mitigate it, B, we can transfer it, C, we can accept the risk, right? And if we're accepting the risk, we better monitor that risk. And the cybersecurity assessment tool does require us to monitor that risk now. And so how are we going to monitor that risk? It could be a to-do for somebody, or we could say, hey, since we're meeting on a regular basis anyway, why don't we monitor that accepted risk in our incident response team meetings? Likewise, policy violations, and I don't have the slide for this webinar, but I've got some statistics that over 60% of information security breaches are still caused by people not following policy. So when it comes to risk monitoring, shouldn't we be monitoring whether our people are following policies? I've heard some banks and credit unions say, well, we rely on our auditors to do that. Really? Once a year? Once a year you're monitoring whether people are following policies? Let's face it, we know that if we don't stay on top of it, people are going to send that top level employee is going to send that email message saying, hey, I know it's against policy to forward jokes, but gosh, this one's worth it. Next thing you know, everybody's forwarding jokes. Next thing you know, someone's clicking on an attachment that they shouldn't be clicking on, and now we're fighting ransomware or some other kind of malware on our network. And then finally, business continuity is the discipline that the non-technical people in our organization now have under control. They now understand, that if an event occurs, we need to respond to that event in an appropriate amount of time, et cetera. And so, business continuity is really something we can leverage for our incident response process, as long as we recognize that incident response is centered around customer notification, not recovery time objectives. Likewise, I really strongly encourage our clients, and we are more than happy to help our managed services clients develop some kind of a graphic to help the incident response team understand the risk monitoring architecture that is in place. We feel that if that the marketing person that's on the incident response team who shows up to the first meeting saying, why am I here? Let me see that customer notification letter, I'll approve it, and then I don't want to have to attend these meetings anymore. Well, there's other things we're going to want the marketing person to be trained upon. But if we can help people understand that we're really relying on the incident response team to monitor for the non-technical events, for the non-technical control failures, such as people forwarding jokes as an example, and that's just one example. There's a myriad of things that we need to look for from an awareness training perspective. And so the bottom line is that it's a good idea to make sure that your incident response team understands how they fit in to the overall risk monitoring architecture. I am a big believer in really guidance requires that we do an annual walkthrough of our incident response plans. And by the way, it's a dotted line between the guidance and our interpretation of the guidance that says that you should do the walkthrough test. There really isn't anything out there that specifically says a walkthrough test of the incident response plan, other than they refer to it in the statement on credentials and the statement on malware that came out in 2015. But examiners are requiring us to test our incident response plan, and so we're referring back to the business continuity guidance on testing, and it basically says you need to have a walkthrough test, you need to have a tabletop test, you need to do functional testing. And so there are some important things that we want to make sure we're touching on when we do our walkthroughs. And the walkthrough definitely should be done on an annual basis, whenever the plan is updated. But I'm really big on making sure that we revisit that walkthrough so that we're not forgetting again the triage process. We want to make sure incident response team members don't have to go look at the plan to decide what's the difference between a notification event, a moderate event, and just a negative event that maybe we want to track it, but we don't need to involve the whole incident response team in. And then even things like insurance review and reviewing the phone numbers that we need to have in our plan, that sort of thing. Do we really only want to do that, once a year, or should we be reminding ourselves what the data privacy insurance actually does cover, and not just the deductibles, but does that data privacy insurance cover forensics? Will our credit monitoring, if we offer credit monitoring to our customers, will they pay for that? Which credit monitoring company are they saying we have to use? And if they're saying we have to use one of their forensics teams, do we understand that there might be cases where we decide we'll go ahead and pay for our own forensics because I don't want the forensics team to come up with the conclusion that the insurance company doesn't have to pay the claim? So the real argument and the main case I'm trying to make with this webinar is that we need to meet monthly, and the cybersecurity assessment tool does establish some ongoing monitoring requirements, especially in domain 2, that need to be addressed. And again, it could be an extra to-do for one person, but if we're already meeting on a regular basis, then maybe we just handle that to-do in the regular meeting. And I encourage my smaller clients to go ahead and start with monthly meetings until you feel like you're to a point now where what's the point of a monthly meeting? And then maybe you can go to bi-monthly meetings where you meet every other month. And then from there, if you really think that those meetings are not productive, then you can go to quarterly meetings. I am not against quarterly meetings. I just want to make sure that your team is trained and that quarterly is enough to cover all the risk monitoring that needs to happen. But if you just look at what needs to happen from a team training perspective, and the requirements for a tabletop test, which means you have to have a test plan that's approved before you actually implement the tabletop test. And then, of course, you have to have the minutes of your tabletop test, and then you have to have the post-mortem review. That's 3 meetings in itself. So, do we want to have, those 3 meetings? That already puts us up to 3 meetings in a year. And then meanwhile, we really should make sure that our incident response team is aware of the tools that are available for us to be able to respond to an incident. And I think the best way probably to illustrate this is just to go to our boilerplate set for incident response. I've noticed it's probably hard to, I guess expanding the window doesn't make it any easier. But our boilerplate set is divided into incident response, the policy, etc. And then just a whole bunch of tools that again, you may or may not adopt. Most smaller organizations are not going to want to have an intrusion detection procedure. You won't want to formally call for the diagramming of your risk monitoring architecture, though it would be, again, a good thing to do and make sure your team understands. But here's what I'm talking about, as the example of what you don't want to formally put in your plan, but let's make our team aware of the fact that, hey, if there ever is an issue where we're frightened and we want to, make sure we're documenting correctly, we do have this log available that walks us through the entire incident. This is just an example of what you can do for that to make sure that we're dotting all the I's and we're crossing all the T's, especially from a legal risk management perspective. If you have good insurance, your insurance should cover a media consulting firm. And so do you really need to use your own media reader? And in this case, based on a boilerplate that was written by an IT guy like, Dan Hadaway? No. But wouldn't it be helpful if the marketing person, without spending a lot of money on a consultant, can at least see what the consultants are probably going to point us to? They might not have us use this exact, process, but this is kind of what we're going to be faced with if the media gets involved in an incident. That's something that can be covered easily in one of your incident response team meetings. And so where I'm kind of heading with this is that I want to spend dedicate a good period of time with the rest of this webinar to the cause of walking you through a standard incident response team meeting agenda. And of course, this is a boilerplate, so it has all this. And by the way, Mike is going to make this available to you. And this was updated as of July 14th, 2016. And it does include the maturity colors. So in other words, if it's in black, well, the maturity colors through intermediate. We decided not to even worry about innovative in this because none of our clients are being required to be at an innovative level of maturity. But if you haven't been through the cybersecurity assessment tool, the third step of the 5-step process is to analyze your control, your cybersecurity control set, and try to determine whether you're at baseline or not. OCC banks have been warned that if you're not at baseline, you're going to get an MRA. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm not sure. The last time I talked to somebody who knew the NCUA pretty well, they said that the NCUA wasn't really putting a lot of emphasis on the cybersecurity assessment tool yet. But we know it's coming down the road no matter who your regulator is. The FDIC and the Fed is somewhere in the middle there. And so just know that if you see it evolving, it's something you don't have to do. It might be a good idea, but it's something that you don't have to do in order to be in compliance with FFIC regulations. And the whole gist of the tool is that everything that's at baseline has always been part of the guidance. We actually disagree with that statement to a degree, but it's the reality now whether or not we agree with the statement. And so we need to get to baseline. And so, all our boilerplates, as I alluded to earlier, they include a map of the program that the boilerplate particularly, is a part of. And then this is all just kind of, larger organizations might want to use this. Most smaller organizations are going to cut a lot of this stuff out. We certainly, if we're a smaller organization, wouldn't want to paint ourselves into a corner, in terms of, distributing the, or distribution of the incident response team meeting, et cetera. But I would consider, no matter how small you are, Infotex has 10 employees, right? And we assign roles to each of our employees, and from an incident response perspective. And obviously, some of these are at the intermediate level, some are at the evolving level. In other words, if you need to be at evolving levels of maturity, you're going to be required to monitor for policy violations, internal threats, et cetera, monitor for media threats, inappropriate social media posts, that kind of stuff is really something that your auditors and examiners are eventually going to be adding to their checklist. Likewise, if you're at the intermediate level, your information security officer should maintain a threat analysis. I propose that all of these are something that you should do at no matter what level of maturity you need to be at. And then I also am proposing that you develop a standard agenda. What are we going to try to cover in every meeting? And so I'm a big believer that you should send out an agenda in advance of the meeting, and then take that agenda, save it as minutes, and just document what's going on in each meeting, and now you have the minutes of the meeting. And so, start the meeting off making sure that, hey, does everybody understand the minutes of the last meeting? Whenever we send out minutes, we highlight action items, and so when we review the minutes of the last meeting, we're actually just looking at the highlighted items saying, did you get that done? Did you get this done? Et cetera. You know how it is. It's one of the reasons why everybody hates meetings, is because you always walk out of a meeting with a to-do list. Well, this makes sure that the to-do list was addressed, or at least that the team can get adequate status on where you are with the to-dos you might have committed to when you're in that incident response team meeting. And then, old business. And so to us, old business is kind of, looking backwards. Did we have any kind of incidents? Were there any kind of, potential incidents that we had to investigate, which, by the way, this one really is more for large organizations. But, again, what might happen is in your last incident response team meeting, someone might have brought up that, what, I think people are forwarding jokes again. I can't tell, because if they are, they've taken us off the list. They figured out that if we're on the list of who they're forwarding the jokes to, then we're going to come down on them for it. It won't take long for people to figure that out, but I'm noticing people, are talking about a particular joke, overheard some or whatever, so we want to investigate that. Well, this is where we would follow up on that investigation. And again, I'm just using the forwarding jokes as an example of a non-technical risk monitoring goal. But then, let's review detailed follow-up reports, whatever, and a lot of smaller banks are like, what, we'll just say old business. We're not going to paint ourselves into this corner here, and that makes total sense to me. Then look at all the reviews that are coming out of guidance that we need to do on a regular basis. And why does the IT person really have to? The IT person's already aware of all this technical stuff. The review really needs to say, hey, this technical report, what of it should the non-technical people know? And so a lot of these reviewers are just basically, let's kind of get some metrics that we can track, because if we see a spike in the total alerts, hey, we might want to put people on guard that we might have become a target of somebody. We've got a lot more people scanning our network now in this month than we did in the previous months. What open tickets do we have with our managed security service provider? We find that our customers really like it when they can see a pie chart showing, that of all the incidents that occurred in the last reporting period, 20% of them were critical risk, 80% were low risk, and there weren't any moderate risk incidents. Makes total sense. It helps the non-technical team kind of understand what's going on. It's good training for them that, hey, we have somebody watching our network, and they're seeing this. This one, even though it's at the intermediate level of maturity, I think is a very, important, concept where, we're integrating the technical with the non-technical. What are we seeing in the event logs? What are we seeing in network traffic that we might be able to turn around and express to our team at large that we might have some issues? And so maybe we see that for some reason, what we always see in August, right, in September, is a spike in people going to the fantasy football league, sites. And so, we can see that in the reports. We can discuss it and decide, do we need to alert management to the fact that this year, our team members are collectively spending twice as much time on this as we did last year? Should we maybe start cautioning people that, hey, you're actually here to work for us, not to run your fantasy football team? That sort of thing. Again, just another example of a non-technical event that, what mechanism do you have to address that sort of thing? I propose it's your regular incident response team meetings, and I propose that it's something you do on a monthly basis so that we, if we're only doing it quarterly and we're going with the last month of the quarter, well, we're not going to be addressing fantasy football until October because we're going to realize it in September, etc. We do need to review and keep an eye on any kind of virus incidents. This is obviously for large. Hopefully, if you have a web defacement incident, it's not plural and it's happened maybe once every 5 years instead of once a month. But this one right here is one that we really want to monitor a lot more than once every quarter. Are we, keeping up on the results of vulnerability assessments? Not only the annual assessments by our auditors, but also, are we doing our own, internal vulnerability assessments, and are we addressing the results of those assessments? Are we reviewing any kind of issues that have been reported over, since the last team meeting? This one, review of severity assignments, is one that I'm kind of recommending our clients get away from, and instead really it's more of a review of the notification classification, centric classification, the notification-centric classifications. A decision tree is something that a lot of our clients are starting to work with. It's a good training tool. Again, their plan might not, call for it because we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner, but it's very helpful to walk our incident response team through a series of if-then statements. We can start with the non-technical that, hey, if we see, company software has been installed at home, what should we do about that? If a user discovers a problem, with an application that, it's a big problem, how do we handle that? How do we handle a lost or stolen portable device? What are we going to do if we find out that our backup tape was, lost, or, we did an inventory and for some reason we can't find one of our backup tapes? The decision tree is a really good tool from a training perspective, and our larger organizations are actually implementing decision trees because they find it to be very helpful. That way they don't really have to dream up how they're going to respond to an incident when it occurs. They've already been there, done that, at least in their imagination. When new audit reports are available, we need to monitor accepted risk, and whether or not we agree with the finding, the first couple months that the finding is fresh in our minds, it's probably accepted risk until we actually address that finding. And if the finding creates a lot of risk, or if it's expressing a lot of risk, let's bring that in the incident response team. Make sure they're aware of that audit finding, so that if a threat does exploit the vulnerability created by the, or that the finding is, expressing, the non-technical people are more on guard and they understand how that can impact us from an incident response perspective. Forensics readiness. The last time I took a quote on a forensics analyst, the one that can, there's two types of forensics, by the way. There's the collection of the evidence, which most people can do. I would engage with a third party. Your managed security service provider can probably do it for you. And if they can, they've got people that will come out on site 24/7 with right blockers and all the equipment they need to be able to collect evidence and gather evidence and keep the chain of custody on the evidence in a manner that's going to stand up in court. That's the first type of forensics. Are we engaged with somebody for that? Does our managed security service provider, offer that to us? What do they need from us? What should we keep in mind? We certainly don't want to, especially smaller organizations, document all that, but we should have an organic understanding of what needs to happen in the event that we need to reach out to a forensics investigator. The second type of forensics, and by the way, the cost of the first type, ranges from, I've seen it as low as $150, an hour to $325 an hour. The second type of forensics investigator is the one that can testify in court. They have experience in litigation. The only difference between the second type and the first type is that they have experience in litigation, and therefore they can be, you can be confident that they will help you in litigation as an expert witness. They still need to maintain their independence, but we want to have somebody that we can hire that will testify on our behalf in court And the last time I looked for pricing on that, it was $600 an hour. I've heard someone say that they took a quote for, it was like $750 an hour. It's not cheap. And so we want to avoid having to use them. And monthly incident response team meetings is one great way to avoid having to use them. But maybe we should consider reaching out because their price goes down substantially if you'll pay them up front. And so maybe we reach out to a firm that has bona fide people that can be expert witnesses in a trial or in deposition, and have them on retainer. Does accounting have the appropriate information to, measure what the losses will be for an incident? Comes right out of cybersecurity assessment tool. Are we reviewing those decision trees? Are we reviewing plans for incident response testing? We can do the incident response tests, at least a walkthrough test and the tabletop test, in the incident response team meeting. We don't have to have a special to-do. If we're meeting monthly, just 1 month we're going to, have the test plan. The next month we're going to test, and the month after that we're going to have the post-mortem review. Your incident response plans are required to have a post-mortem review after any incident. Do you want to have a special meeting for that, or can we just do that in the next incident response team meeting, which, by the way, the post-mortem review should be added up here as old business. And by the way, I haven't said this, but our boilerplates are just a starting point. They're not perfect by any means, but they're really meant to be an example. And yet, you're going to need to take this and develop it and turn it into something that's, adequate for your company. I'm noticing the time, and so I want to go back to my presentation because I want to make sure that we have enough time for the drawing, all the festivities that Mike takes over at the end of the webinar. So, Michael, I'm turning control back to you.
Thanks, Dan.
Any questions?
We don't currently have any questions, but we do have a little bit of business to take care of. We do have a poll that we would like to draw your attention to. We actually have 2 polls.
I'll go ahead and start the Jeopardy thing.
Thanks, Dan.
I'm dancing. My mom is going to be so enlightened by the fact that I've been able to integrate the Jeopardy theme into what I do for a living.
Also, we do have our winner for today. I will reach out and let you know by email. And one last webinar, or one last poll, and this is back a couple slides, Dan.
Oh, sorry about that. Is it, the evaluation survey, got it.
No, actually, it's would you invite your whole team to a webinar. Also, just another reminder, as soon as this ends, we're going to have a very short survey pop up. If you could answer that for us, we'd really appreciate it. And thank you all for your time. I'm going to close this poll. Thank you for your time today. Thank you, Dan, for all of your very pertinent information. And I hope everyone has a great day and a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
When you view an InfoTex webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you're agreeing to the terms posted at the web page listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what InfoTex presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with InfoTex webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but InfoTex reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our transfer of copyright agreement at the web page listed in this slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the web page shown on this slide.